When talking about service mesh, we usually talk about two main types of service mesh. These types are in-process and sidecar. Let's see what these types are. And first, in-process service mesh. In this type, we have the services, and the service mesh is implemented as a software component which is part of the services process itself. This way, when the service wants to communicate with other services, it simply calls methods in the mesh, which in turn performs a network call to the other mesh, which relays the message to the service it resides in. You probably see why this type is called in-process. The service mesh is part of the services process, and no inter-process communication is required to use it. The other type is sidecar. With sidecar, we again have the services, but this time the service mesh is implemented as an out-of-process component and is not part of the services process. So now, when a service wants to communicate with other services, it first makes a network call to the mesh component that belongs to it. The mesh component makes another call to the mesh component of the called service, and this component then calls the service we want to talk to. This approach is called sidecar because the mesh component is located near the service, like in a real sidecar, and not in the services process. Now, which one is better? Should we go with in-process or sidecar service mesh? So let's compare the two and see what are the pros of each approach. The main and obvious advantage of the in-process approach is, of course, performance. With the in-process approach, we will perform only a single network call when using the service mesh. This is the call that is performed between the mesh components themselves, and there are no network calls between the services and the mesh components, since they are part of the services process. On the other hand, the advantage of sidecar are these. First, it's platform agnostic. Since the service mesh is located outside the service itself, we don't care how is it implemented. For example, if the service is developed using .NET Core and the mesh is implemented using Node.js, there is no problem, because they don't need to share the same process. That means we are open to a lot more service mesh implementations, regardless of the platform the service is based on. Another advantage of the sidecar approach is that it's code agnostic. This means the service's code should not be changed to use the sidecar mesh. From the service point of view, it just calls an external service exposing a standard API. The service should not even know this API is of the service mesh and that it performs routing, validation, etc., and not just a simple call. When the mesh is part of the services process, the services code should be modified to accommodate the mesh software component, and it should be aware of its methods and interfaces. This is not the case with sidecar. Now, because of these advantages, sidecar implementations are far more popular than in-process implementations, as we will see in the next lecture, and you probably should also usually go for the sidecar path, unless some very strict performance requirements are in place.